Three, two, one, and action. Welcome. Did I say welcome? Welcome back. I want to correct myself. Last video I posted, I made the great error, something I never want to do, but it's a good example of how quickly vanity, how quickly ego can sneak into the mix, especially when the intent is to record something and you are face to face with yourself as you do so. That, in and of itself, is a great challenge to vanity. And in reflecting back on my previous video, I noticed that I mentioned, as I introduced the audience to the video, that I was the ranting rose. That's crazy. I am nothing, as I said before, but instead, this is the ranting rose. Welcome to all of you. If it's your first time, welcome back. If this is a second or further video that you've seen of ours, and this is essentially a space, a place for a conversation. I want this to be a forum where we can all come together and contemplate life. The so many ideas that we have, the so many contemplations and reflections we can make on everyday usage of words and what those things mean and what life means and the trials and tribulations we may go through along the way, and just aiming to, with our intent, build something instead of complaining about something, or to a worser extent, destroying something in the process of trying to construct something. Oof. So again, I'm thinking about something different and want to share it with you in live time as I come to process it myself. And that today is the concept of work. I'm thinking a lot as I ride my bike back from dropping off my wife to work today about what is the concept of work. What does work mean, As I think of work, almost automatically, I come up with one particular thing. Like my conscience drives towards one particular thing, and that particular thing is my job, right? What I do to pay the bills and hopefully continue having this apartment and food to fill my belly and much more. Of course, we can think of things, the luxury of enjoying a television show, which requires a bill. I used to operate a car to get around, which requires a bill. So the job is the thing that we seemingly must do unless we are not only creative enough, but also driven enough and have the capital to compete with others in the matter of having a business. And I think later we can even explore what the word and concept of business is, which is quite interesting as well. But now thinking about work, and my mind jumps to the idea that work is me clocking into a place to do a task, in my respect or in my regard, service, right, for a restaurant, and that I do it well enough or long enough to collect a paycheck, and I use that paycheck to pay my bills, and I survive or thrive depending on how many people come into the restaurant or how good I am at the task. And I think about like that. Is that really what work means, right? Or is that just a job, which requires work? I'm thinking about, what does work mean to me? When I think about it, work can be so many things. For instance, I've really enjoyed as of late reading the Bible, and I would consider that a great work. I mean, contemplating, reading, comprehending, and I guess at the end of the day, only theorizing what I believe it could mean. Those sacred and divine words that are gifted to us by God. I also consider work. Maybe I have a garden. Maybe I'm doing some work in the garden. So there's many other things. Maybe I'm working on a project outside of work. You know what I mean? And so I have to like take those little pieces and put them together and try to think about what do they have in common. The best that I can come up with is work is it's certainly an effort. Yeah, it's certainly utilizing your life source, right? Your energy, your freedom of life in order to accomplish a certain task, or really not even in the effort to accomplish a certain task. You can still work just by providing the effort, which is against what you most likely, with given all freedom and all resources, do otherwise, which is almost nothing. You would just sort of relax, right? You would maybe have instincts in your head to do things along the way of total relaxation, because for many of us, I'm sure if not for all of us, that might be impossible. But as soon as you cross that threshold, I would call it work. And so that's what I theorize. That's what I come up with when I think of work. But I also think about how ironic it is that my mind is seemingly programmed to go directly into the way of thinking about work as the prescribed work given to me by a job, right? And it goes further when I ask the question of, what is the most important type of work that you can do? I think most everyone would say to themselves, well, it's my job. That's how I pay the bills. That's how I feed my children. That's how I feed myself. And to some extent, that's true. That's true. But if you throw the factor of death in the middle, right, which is inevitable for all of us, and take yourself outside of yourself and present and reflect back on all the moments that you've been in what we're calling now work, what would then your priority be? Would it still be the job, right, that paid the bills and kept food in your belly? I don't know. Would the work in your garden be more important than that? Would the work you maybe put into your marriage be more important than that? Or even the other social relationships that we maintain in life? Or the work of passion, right? That the work that some of us take on without being paid, just because we simply not only enjoy to do it, but we're naturally driven to do it for some inherent purpose, we'll call it. That could be explored further. But if you were to stack up all of the work that you've done, and taking yourself outside of present moment and imagining a moment which will ultimately come, which is where you die and are no longer physically here, what would you consider to be the most important, the top priority of your work? And most likely, everything that you've gained in the anchor thought of work, meaning the money, meaning the homes, meaning the food in your belly. I mean, those will most likely be left without you. But I mean, what about, and the home is an arguable point, right? But for the sake of the argument and the exploration, let's consider, the money and the feeding of the bellies. All those things were important. But what about the passionate projects that you've left behind, especially when it comes to the social relationships, the familial relationships, those passion projects that you've taken on, oftentimes for no pay whatsoever, that you may have left behind for someone else to pick up, or someone at least to view, which might be meaningful to them. And in some way, I would say that you might leave that behind, but it exists as a part of you potentially forever. Whereas in the work that we do at our job, I don't know if it lasts that long, or if it's even, if we contemplate it, much more important or important at all as those other projects. And so I think it's important to imagine a type of life that we could construct where more of our work was based on purpose than it would be to make ends meet, like a job, And what if we could construct a society where the framework of such was less inclined to add pressure to force people to have jobs as much as it provided resources for people to survive, such that they could do work that actually gave purpose, not only to themselves, but to their families, to their communities, the world at large, to our present moment, and the future, which most likely, if things continue, will always result after your death, you know? And so I think that's really important. I think that's really, really important to kind of make a differentiator between the concept of work and the concept of a job. And that should we have the power to place our work in a place that we found most important, and should we have the opportunity to even contemplate it to the point that we could put priority on the work that actually gave us purpose more so than the work that provided an ends to what we needed, right, in this construction, that we would probably find ourselves doing a lot more what I would consider truly good work. And the former, you know, the job, you know, I guess there's people who talk about that they, find something you love and you'll never work a day in your life. I mean, even when you see people do this, right, in the form of business, like my point from the previous, being self-employed and maybe a passionate endeavor, I don't know. I don't know. The work, it does seem to burn oneself. I mean, having taken it on a few times with little success, from the sheer drainage and knowledge of that drainage that it caused me to burn in the process of trying to construct a business, I don't know entirely if that's a fruitful choice for our works, you know? And more so than that, in an ever competing marketplace and an ever differentiator between who has and who doesn't, there's an increase of pressure in that environment to even have a chance to have a business. And even once you actually have a business, just to sustain it is also a lot of pressure and a lot of management. And sure, people say, passive income and all that sort of thing. I don't really know that it exists. To some extent, you still have to be attached to that new work that you've created in some way to keep it afloat. And there may be varying levels of the effort that you have to give, but still, at the end of the day, I think that you do have to do that. And so I think it would be important for us to imagine, if we are assessing that the most important parts of our lives as we imagine upon death, the work that we've provided to the world, to be those in familial relationships, social relationships, communal relationships, and also those real inherent, it seems, God-driven almost passion projects that we feel called to perform, not really for money at the end of the day, but something that actually provides purpose, that we should collectively find a way to do those things more than we do other forms of work. And again, there are outlying examples. I'm not trying to say that no one does that, or no one has the opportunity to do that, or no one has the great blessing of doing that, however you want to phrase it. But I think a lot of us, I mean, if we're just being honest with ourselves, a lot of us struggle to even have the potentiality to do that. Just in my own personal life, and the closest people to me, I can see that almost 100% all people are fighting that. They're fighting the knowing what they enjoy to do, yeah? What they would literally work towards with not a penny provided because they're called to do it. And yet they find themselves trapped in this work environment because they feel they need to do things for certain things. And that may be true to an extent, but I think if we can push towards basically just a few things, right? Is at a bigger bubble, relieving ourselves from the system that makes us do that, right? How do we do that? Well, most certainly, I would think that would require having less or possibly no debt whatsoever, even though there will be recurring bills to some extent over great time and with great discipline and great sacrifice. That can be remedied to a certain extent. There is still a lot of debt in most of our lives that is placed upon ourselves willingly by ourselves to attain certain things that either we dream of or are placed in our minds to dream of, to cultivate that sort of debt, to keep us really latched onto a system, having to perform the works in order to pay that debt to have those things, right? And it may be actually something that needs to be explored further to understand maybe the unnatural nature of the dreams that we want, how influenced they could be by advertising, social culture, social norms that have come to be, and the pressures that those add to the ideas we have of what we need to do or what we want to do. And I think that it could be very, very important to go back to a base level and understand for each given person, which may vary considerably depending on the resources that we naturally have and come from, what we need. And I think, again, I've explored this in another video, and you can quest there if you'd like to, or just take my word for it, that the basic needs are not so different for all of us. Like, I would like to have food. I think that I would be better at surviving on this earth for it. And I would like to have shelter, and I would like to clothe my body and feel warm in the winter time and cooler in the summertime. I mean, all these sort of things, like base level things. And maybe start to eradicate some of those other things that aren't on that level. Because to really entertain this conversation, I think we have to realize that potentially things have gotten a little out of whack. And the only way to get them back into balance would be to really start with the foundational things that we really can't argue against that we need in our lives. Now, second to really creating that list and adhering to that list with full intensity, which is hard enough as it is for most people, we would also have to cultivate means to be able to produce or create these things outside of the system that currently exists so that we could have these things in a way that was more definite, meaning the food production could be more owned by us than bought from us, so that we could have the control of it being what they call sustainable, that it could be managed appropriately for the purpose of humanity for almost infinity. And this would take a great collection of efforts, because you certainly couldn't do that alone. You could, but you would have to have an amazing amount of skill sets, an amazing amount of know-how, an amazing amount of capital. There may be few on the list who want to live this sort of life and then end up living it, only realizing that it's much more difficult than it was to go back to work. And I think that part of the stem of that problem comes from the individual aspect of attempting that dream and not having a collective communal experience, which I think really to any degree made that possible in the past. But I think that we would have to apply a lot more of our energy, a lot more of our work, let's say, in really just strategizing how that may be possible, having open conversations, establishing communities, becoming in real time more connected with others. Because I think these things, although to some extent could exist in technology, the framework of how they would be humanely cultivated would be much better in real person. And so aside from that, and along with that, that, we would have to get used to how that looks, and the dreams we have for self, again, cultivated by a lot of things that I talked about previously with the advertising and the social culture and the norms and pressures that come with it, that what the actual results of that might be a lot less diversified, might be a lot less luxurious than we originally planned for. And I'm talking about a lot less. But what if we thought about, as we made that sacrifice, the freedom that they would provide to us, and maybe even the better nourishment at the end of the day that they would provide to us, especially considering the fact that we can look at the diversity and we can look at the luxury, even especially from an aesthetic viewpoint, and see that many times, and increasingly so, as the future progresses, I don't know if they're the same quality from a nutrient standpoint with the food, or even from a material standpoint and the longevity of such, from supposed luxury, especially with like new construction and manufactured homes and that sort of thing. We would really have to dive deep and figure out, would I rather have less, much, 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 much less, of not only what I would consider a higher quality from the standpoint of how long it can live on its own without further needing fluff and further needing energy to get that fluff, or will we continually allow ourselves to be programmed to this idea that we need more things, and better and bigger and more complex things, because we're following an image of the things that are inclined to our minds to be the appropriate things to get? That will be a very, 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 very tough mission for us. But I think it is really a mission that we should take on. And the most glorious thing at the end of the day, I think, from taking it on, either individually, which can be harder, or hopefully in all God's prayer that we can do it more collectively, is that we'll have the ability, then sustaining our basic needs, to have more of our time for those passion projects, those things we feel that we're called to do without any compensation, to share our gifted sense of humanity with the world for a betterment, not for our lives, but for what we would imagine being the result of our lives after our inevitable death, as we mentioned previously, taking ourselves outside of the realm of our life existence and imagining the inevitable, and then suggesting to self what we could do with given time in order to do the things we know or imagine outside that frame of time to be the most purposeful, and to actually give us the most longevity in life outside of our life, right? Which means, throwing the rock in the pond and seeing those small ripple effects. And I would say, sometimes a lot of smaller rocks may have more reverberations than one big clunk dump, and that's all. So I think by having more ability to take on these real purpose projects, which again can just be having conversations like this, where we're daring enough to be vulnerable enough and brave enough, and maybe even appear sort of foolish to some, to open ourselves up to the ideas which I think a lot of us have in our hearts, but may not be readily encouraged to take on. And so moving against that pressure in a way which is alleviating it potentially later on for others is, I think, a really, 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 really rewarding way to live one's life. And I think the ironic thing about that is that it's, again, not rewarding in the sense that we all, or most of us, would think of reward being. How interesting that it could be actually opposite of that. That we feel like the reward system would be some great notion of success, or more money, or reward, right? Like a better outcome. It's really, really important to start to play with words and scramble them up again to make sure that they mean what we think they mean, that we would be striving for a reward that really isn't monetized. It's that feeling of peace that one has, that they know that when given a constraint of time that was outside of their control, that they did with it really and intently all that they could, not only for themselves, but for the betterment of all others, and without really the vanity of claiming that time for themselves. They tend to be something that's really, really, I think, human and transcendent of this idea we have of being people, kind of locking ourselves in a bit of a cage to work in only one particular direction. And even when we become more creative and come up with other ideas like the self-employment, the business idea, the nonprofit idea, this, with careful examination, you can see it kind of maybe starting in a different way, but kind of drifting back to the same lock cage of keeping us very, very binded to the same sort of construction. And it's just very interesting. I think that we're provided a lot more freedoms than we allow ourselves to realize. But because we honestly are so often scared to work outside of those systems and really take on the great risk and sacrifice required to truly do that, that we end up, like, just like I said, locking ourselves back in the box, going right back there to do the things that seem so ordinary and comfortable and convenient. And that's all cool, like, we all have the freedom to do those things. But I would really hope, like, for ourselves, who at the end of the day, I don't think that I can escape it. Like, at the end of the day, I will have to confront myself, I will have to die. I will not be here. And I would hope that as much of my time as possible was spent doing, like, what I would call true work, true work. Like, I think that something exists inside all of us that wants to do true work. And I think each of us has been given really special gifts to do that work. And I think one of the scariest things to take on that work is the fact that the world, A, may not care at all about it in our time, and B, that the reward for such would look just far different than the rewards we've been, like, programmed to believe are the only rewards. But I can tell you, as a human who has so many emotions, it's not always a great way that I look on this work, although generally I do. It can be hard sometimes, but I hope that we have the ultimate, consolation that we can be at peace with really, really knowing we tried. I think one of the greatest, I don't want to say regrets, but, like, I think one of the greatest hardships for us is and will be at a later date, having putting those things to the side, to realize we were so scared that we actually didn't try. And I think that a lot of us potentially spend, like, most of our whole lives in the macrocosm of that. And I know that I have tremendously and daily find myself falling back into, I mean, obviously still am inside of that. And I don't think it's as important to fully break out as much as it is to have to control the stone being thrown in the pond, or the several small stones, better at that, so that you can continue an energy that is different than the opposing, which is a reverberation which comes from it, goodness, goodness. Like, you can't take away goodness. It's good, And so really wanting and desiring to help others and share with others, for however hard that may be and however vulnerable that may force you to be in the process, I think is a great joy to have, and a great peace to have, and something I really, really feel we're called to do. So I'm super grateful that I can be with you today. I'm super grateful for anyone who really made it thus far in this video and may like share the same thought processes, or at least is stoked by them in a way that they can contemplate them further and sit with them further, and like add to them as well. Because as I always say, like I'm literally nothing, you know. I'm nothing, especially without him. And I pray that he may make of my nothing something for you. You know, that could be cool. That could be really something that would give me peace. And so this is my passion project. This is my work, you know, and no one pays this. No one pays for this to me, and that's okay, you know. And you know, also maybe no one sees this, and I have to realize that that's okay too, because somebody did, you know. And that's important. I'm terrified of important things that are important things that one should be terrified of, which is what will it be when it's no more, you know, when it's no more and I'm no more, you know. And I'm not terrified of it in a way that is some people are terrified, like you know, they feel like they're running out of time and all this sort of stuff, you know. I'm in some way at peace, but I'm terrified for the idea that I might, you know, get to some place after this, have the ability to realize, you know, the timeline of it all, and in that moment most likely desire to do so much more, and be able to observe that timeline and realize that so much of that I virtually did nothing, not because I couldn't, you know, not because I couldn't, because I was scared. Isn't that crazy? And how many of us fall into that, you know, feeling like we could do so many things, but should we, you know, can we, you know, does anyone care, you know? And I'm really thankful to God that the framework of my mind is beginning to shift to realize that those things don't really matter as much as trying. um, and I believe in him, and I believe in good things being able to come from very small efforts. I think he's the ultimate caster of tiny, tiny pebbles in the tides, you know, in the tides in the ponds, you know, that create tides, that create movements of goodness. And we are also in the midst of that, you know. We have the great freedom to be able to cast our own stones, you know. And it gives me great joy to realize how much I naturally loved skipping rocks when I was a kid. And there was an age where I probably counted how many skips, but back in the day I just loved skipping the rocks, and that's what this is about, you know. I want to get back to a time where I'm just skipping rocks, you know, and that is really, really a beautiful life when you're just skipping rocks. And how can I prove that? How can I prove that? We can all prove that when we look at a child. When we look at a child just skipping rocks, when you look at an elderly person, I see it. I've seen it. Elderly person just sitting on a bench and looking at a tree. They're just skipping rocks, you know. And so I really do believe in our hearts we're called to do that. We have the potentiality for that. If we can just get out of our own way and let him lead us, right? Because I do not have the ability to get over that fear that I have. It is with me, you know. When I finish this video, it will be with me, you know. But the most important thing is that I really ask for his help, and I I latch on to him with my prayer, of helping me through that and helping me avoid the thoughts that I know are not of him and are me as a person and not me as a child of him. For he calls me not to fear. Isn't that interesting? So I'll end it in prayer today in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, thank you for that great wisdom that you tell us in so many instances we can see in your word to have no fear, right? I have a bracelet on my arm right now and it says, fear is not an option. That's a longer story. It is an option, I've come to know. And what we will do with it, I think, is the most important thing. So, praying to God with praise and worship for his almighty wisdom, his almighty wisdom to be with us and help us shape a life for ourselves that can serve him. And in attempting to serve him, he lets us know that there's no need to fear. And I'm praying for all of us to have less fear in our lives and to know the great power of being vulnerable and humble and speaking that which you feel in your heart from God. The almighty righteousness needs to be said, especially if that is done in a calm, peaceful way and is meant to nourish others for no cause of your own. That is, I think, a good thing to profess. And he will tell you, I am no authority. He will tell you what those things are for you. And he will tell you what those things are to do for you. And I suggest that you follow him because one day you'll see him again. So I pray today for a great power of his to fill us and allow us to have less fear in our days, to cast those small rocks in the pond and to sit idly by and witness the beauty of their reverberations on the world around us. What a great joy it is to be alive and with him again. And I'm praying for us all that we may be blessed and kept by him always. Until the next time, I wish you joy, I wish you peace, and I wish you to learn and know God more and more day by day. Peace and blessings be upon you. Amen. Amen.